Good evening and welcome to the Monday, August 9th, Maplewood City Council Manager Workshop. Assistant City Manager Sable, would you do our roll call for us?
Certainly. Councilmember Villavicencio.
Aye.
Councilmember Knutson.
Here.
Councilmember Cave.
Here.
Councilmember Juneman.
Must be best to last since I'm always last. Here.
Mayor Abrams.
Here as well.
Mayor, you have a quorum.
Thank you very much. Is there a motion to approve our agenda tonight?
So move.
Second.
Moved by Knutson, seconded by Juneman. The motion to approve the agenda. Is there any further discussion? Hearing none, then let's take a vote. All those in favor? Aye. Any opposed? The motion passes. We have no unfinished business tonight. We have new business, which is our budget workshop. We are really excited about this. We can't wait to dig into the budget. Ms. Pulseth, welcome.
Me okay?
Now we can.
Great. Okay, thanks. We do have a full session tonight, a full workshop tonight. So we're going to try as much as possible to kind of stick to the high points and the policy decisions, pain points, whatever you want to call it. But we have a lot to talk about tonight. There's a lot of things that went into tonight's session that involved the budget in some way. Before I start, I wanted to introduce the masked man in the audience, my assistant, Joe Rube, and he's starting to work a lot more hands-on with the budget as well, so he wanted to join us tonight and see how it worked.
Welcome,
So,
Joe.
Thank you. So in your packet, you do have a handout that I do every year called the City Manager's Budget Proposal. And it has a narrative and kind of a description of really the whole process, everything except the nitty-gritty details, which we will provide you that next time. We're kind of looking for some general direction and policy decisions tonight, but if you have time, reading through that would be, I think, very helpful to get you familiarized with the budget and just kind of what the driving forces are. So we will start with the PowerPoint. So tonight, we're going to just talk a little bit about how we came to what we're presenting you tonight, some of the challenges we had to work through, some of the strategies that we've been working on for years. We're also going to talk a little bit about some ideas that we have to lower the budget and lower the levy for your consideration tonight. We'll talk a little bit about the general fund surplus that was left over or that was a result of the fiscal year 2020. And for those of you who may not have been on council at that time, there was a surplus. It was in a way related to the CARES Act because the city received CARES money and was able to save money in other areas of the budget. So there was, at the time, roughly $2 million in surplus. Those of you who are on council will remember that you dedicated that or committed that surplus to the fire hall in the event that the London Lane property would fall through, that property sale. So at this point, it is still committed to the fire hall, but it is looking more and more likely that that surplus will be available for you. So we'll talk a little bit about how that fits in. And then we'll also get a good discussion going on the ARPA funding. No decisions tonight, of course, but getting some general advice from you and direction as to maybe where you'd like to go with that. And then we'll talk about what comes next. We do have another couple of workshops, and we'll talk a little bit about policies as well. Again, everything in the budget is in the strategic priorities in some way. For the most part, every priority shown here is included in the budget in some way or another. Tonight, we'll mostly be talking about financial stability and operational effectiveness because what we're really geared for tonight is talking about the property tax levy, and that will involve mostly the general fund and the debt service funds. So that's going to be the center of our discussion tonight. For those of you that have been on the council, you know that there's a lot of other financial activity that runs through the city that has its own revenue sources. So to get started, right off the bat, we'll throw the news at you. Initially, what we're presenting is a 5.3% levy increase. Keep in mind, I just mentioned we had some ideas to reduce that by about 1%. So we'll walk through that in a moment. Down at the bottom of this chart, you can see approximately what a 2% levy increase would raise, about $464,000. The 6% would raise $1,393,000. And this budget, as it's presented, would raise $1,240,000 over last year. So that's a 5.3%. Most of that is the general fund, and there's a small amount that is related to the debt service funds. The debt service requirements for 2022 are slightly higher because of the fire hall, about $102,000. Not to be too concerned because we're seeing some debt dropping off in the next couple of years. So we have it worked out so that we plan for a fairly level debt service schedule, and we're slowly seeing those debt service requirements come down. However, now that I've said that, we don't know what interest rates will be for our next issuance or the issuances beyond that. We've been pretty lucky the last decade, I guess. So just to take a look at what the councils have done in the past from 2013 to 2022, there's some zeros in there, some 2s, 4s, 3.5, 3, 5.3 being the highest that you would have ever considered. But if you average that out over the past 10 years, it averages to 3%. And we always say that that's sort of a good, marker to look at is to cover inflation and to cover the increased needs. We look at around 3% as an annual requirement. However, we don't live in that kind of a perfect world. Sometimes we're dealt other blows from the property tax system, and so the levy goes up and then from the economy and the environment. So the levy does tend to go up and down a little bit, but for the most part, we remain fairly constant at a 3%. So here's the important piece. How did the levy change from last year? What made it increase? I already mentioned the debt service. That was about $100,000. We're adding the playground back into the CIP fund. So as a little history lesson here, in every year, as is customary for Maplewood, was to replace one playground every year in approximately, I don't know, maybe 40 parks or something like that, maybe more. One playground a year gets replaced, and we levy for that. Last year, to get the levy to 0, we had to take the playground out. So we'd be building that back in. A slight increase in our capital funds, about $65,000, because we're running a little bit short as equipment prices continue to rise. And last year, we went with a 0. So this year, we really can't. We really do need to raise it. The payroll adjustments alone, that includes a calculation of a 3% increase for all employees. And the reason that we included that was to be on the safe side. The contracts are not yet settled. We don't know what they're going to be. But to be on the safe side, since there was a 0% in the prior year, even though there was a one-time payment, we decided that we had better go with the 3%. That also includes some step adjustments for some employees and some new FTEs, and I'll cover that in another slide. But that's the lion's share of it. That's a little over $800,000. Some of the recommendations that we're going to have for you further on down in the slide deck have to do with this line item and about how to repurpose some FTEs a little better. Next, we're adding in some consulting fees. We also may be able to save some there. $20,000 was ostensibly for a city manager search that may or may not happen, and $10,000 was for a compensation study, which will likely happen this year, and we do have some surplus that we can use to fund that this year. So it's possible that we could have some savings there, and that's part of what we're going to be talking about tonight. Increasing liability insurance, mostly due to the police, not anything our police did, but police in general across the state. So some increases in liability. And then again, in some of our capital charges. We've also had some decreases in revenue. So I budgeted for a $62,000 decrease in the DMV revenue, simply because there was a significant revenue loss in the prior year, obviously due to COVID. A lot of our customers, we believe, started mailing them into the state, and maybe they'll continue to do that. We just don't know. So just to mitigate, that was a sort of a minimizing risk. It's a number that we can massage to get us closer to where we want to be, but that was kind of where I felt comfortable. And there was also a decrease in rental housing revenue. The housing revenue proceeds or fees not exactly coming out quite to the level that we expected it. This was our very kind of our first year. We really haven't even completed a full year yet. Some things that helped us, we had some increases in our state aid and small increase in our transfers from our utility funds. So overall, there's a lot of small things that go in and out, but those are the primary drivers of the 1.2 million. So just to take a really high-level look, as I said, we'll have some more detail for you next time. And at a very high level, the general fund is going up about 4.3%. As you can see, in 2021, the second column, the city budgeted for a $100,000 surplus. And the reason we do that is to cover to continue to increase the fund balance, because the expenditures keep increasing, and so the need to have fund balance increases. So again, to remind you that we don't get property taxes until July, but yet we have to pay bills from January to July. So we have to have 50% of our expenditures in our fund balance, and we'll cover that again on another slide. As inflation increases expenditures, so does it increase the need for that fund balance to make that 40 to 50% that we're striving for. To cut right to the chase here, we are also proposing in this initial budget a $100,000 surplus, but that is one of the items that we are looking at seeing a possible savings in a couple of slides. So just keep that in mind. It's for two things, to help increase the fund balance, and to also to help offset higher than normal property tax petitions. Sometimes we get unpleasantly surprised. One year it was 750,000 that, and we typically plan for about 200,000. And so, we like to make sure that we have that covered, but we'll explain to you in the next couple of slides how we're going to manage that. So there was some staffing changes, so this gets a little bit complicated, but there was about 3 full-time staff, 3 FTEs increased. And what that amounts to is we have 2 employees who are working in the DMV who are currently being paid for with a COVID grant. And that's how they were paid in 2020 as well. That probably won't be able to continue beyond this year, so we had to build them into the budget. So that's 2 of the employees. Having said that, once we get a couple of slides ahead, we've got some ideas that we may be able to fix that situation. There's also a 0.75 FTE increase in the fire department, and that was for command staff. However, it did not involve an increase in the budget because there was still savings left over from the reorganization from last year. Eventually, yes, it will increase the budget, but to this point, it did not. And that was the plan. So again, just to walk through that real quickly, the 5.3% tax levy challenge that we're dealing with, came largely from payroll increases, debt service, adding back the playground, increasing our capital funds, and projected reduction in revenues. We also have potential tax petitions to think about with that surplus. So I won't go too deeply into this because this is something the city manager is working on. But one of the ideas, or a couple of the ideas that we had to reduce the levy, one would be to eliminate that $100,000 surplus for this year. And in the next slide, I'm going to explain to you why we feel safe in doing that. The other two are restructuring those two COVID employees. There are currently positions in the organization that are open that they may be able to fill. So the city manager is working on that. So I guess that's all I really have to say about that at this point, but we're hoping that we can come back next time with some better news by being able to reorganize some things. It may mean that that customers won't have a number to call in for an appointment. They will have to make their appointment on the website. A lot of deputy registrars are doing that, and some cities who have deputy registrars, it's website only. But there are a number of different options that we're looking through that may not even have to be the case, and maybe we may be able to have employees that can double up. So that's, being the city manager is absent tonight, I really won't speak to that anymore, other than approximately $240,000 is a 1% levy decrease. So that's where we're hoping to get you down to 4.3, which is a little more tolerable, but about as far down as we would feel comfortable going, given the situation with the staffing being at 3%. So, okay, now we're going to switch gears just a little bit and talk about that surplus again that I mentioned. So I mentioned a $2 million surplus. So a few months ago, I brought a presentation to you, and we talked about potentially being able to reallocate 1.6 million of that, since it is just it's surplus at this point, over and above what the city needs in the general fund. Part of our discussion about eliminating the $100,000 surplus fits into this. Rather than allocating 1.6, this slide now recommending to you only allocate 1 million and then leave some back so that we don't have to worry about levying extra for a surplus or for property tax petitions for a couple of years. Yes, we'll eventually have to do it again, but we know about it, it's planned, it's not exactly like we're digging a huge hole. It's perfectly fine in my view to do that. So what basically changed is some of these numbers, some of these allocations went down a little bit, approximately $250,000 to the building fund. We're running a little short there. And some of the equipment funds and the employee benefit fund, which was running a little bit short of covering the liabilities. So, and the EDA fund was originally on here, and the reason it is not is because I've now moved it to the new funding source with the ARPA funds. So this is just to talk about for now, but that's kind of a new proposal, and we can still tweak it. But that would be only spending $1 million then of that, what was originally a $2 million surplus. So what would that do? So if we follow this screen, this is our fund balance projections. The red line is the minimum of where we would, where our target fund balance is for the general fund, which is 5 months of expenditures, which is 41.67%. The green line is our maximum target, which is 50% of expenditures, which is 6 months. And so anywhere in between there is fine. The rating agencies love to see it as high as you will take it. The state auditor prefers that we don't have an extensive amount of fund balance over our maximum target without having it committed or reserved for a purpose, which is why we committed it, part of the reason we committed it to the public safety fire station, and also because of the London Lane property not being completed, property sale. So where we're at in 2020 is we were at about 61.6%, so above what is needed for our need, for our cash flow needs. In 2021, we're expecting that to be reduced, and this could be very conservative, but it's expecting that to be reduced to 56%, which is still above our needs. In 2022, with this budget that we're showing you now, 53%, and I believe this particular chart actually shows it with that surplus not levied for in 2022. So you can see it eventually, because this assumes 3% inflation every year in the expenditures, it eventually erodes, the value of that surplus. But it carries us through through the end of this period, 2026, quite well before it gets under that 50% level where we're going to start watching it again. So that's why we would feel comfortable with eliminating some of the reallocations and saving the fund balance. We would feel comfortable not levying for the next few years. In fact, this particular chart shows no surplus being levied through 2026. So it works out fairly well for us to do that. Again, at the end of 2021, we can always reconsider if the fund balance is more than what we're projecting here. That's awesome. Then this council will be able to look at this again and decide where they want to reallocate or how much they want to reallocate. I know you probably have a million questions, but we don't have too much more to go. And then I promise you, we will have plenty of time to discuss all your concerns. So now we move on to the ARPA funding. So the city just received the first half of its $4.3 million installment of the rescue plan funding. This is a nice little boost. So it is in an account earning interest, and we will receive the second half of it less than a year from today. The same date that we received the first half, we'll receive the second half. So we took a look at some of the needs, and again, this is for discussion purposes and for your consideration. So by no means is this an all-inclusive list or has there been any decisions made. But we took a look at what our capital needs were. The money has to be spent by the end of December 2024. So we took a look at what we had in our capital improvement plan. And obviously the elephant in the corner has always been the ladder truck. And a million apologies here. This should say ladder truck, pumper truck, and grass truck because there's 3 pieces of equipment in the CIP, and I just didn't get them all labeled. But the ladder truck itself is about $1.2 million or $1.25 million, and then the pumper truck is about I think maybe $850, maybe a little more, and the grass truck maybe $50. We can easily accommodate the grass truck into our current public safety equipment fund. However, the ladder truck, we don't have a plan for that. The plan was debt. And the way it looks is we would also probably need to borrow for the pumper truck. That would not be for a couple more years. The ladder truck was in 2022, and I believe the pumper truck 23, I think. But anyway, that's a big chunk right there. So there's 3 pieces of fire equipment in that $2 million. Makes that $4 million start to look a lot smaller. The second line item is ambulances. So that's the ambulances and the cardiac monitors that were in the CIP from 2022 to 2024. One of the things that I want you to keep in mind about the ambulances is that a good portion of the funding that we're getting through the ARPA grant is going to be drawn down through what's called revenue replacement or revenue loss. So about $2.6 million has been calculated so far to be drawn down through revenue loss. And I want to spend just a second on that just to make sure that there's not a lot of confusion about that. So what happens Did we lose 2.6 million? And were the revenues in 2020 less than the revenues in 2019 by 2.6 million? No. The revenues in 2020 were less by about 800,000, and that is on an entity-wide basis, not just the general fund. It's the entire city, less some federal funding, like the CARES grant and that kind of thing is not includable. So what the federal government has us doing is in the guidance. You take 2019 is the base year, so those are your base year revenues. So the includable revenues would be those revenues that are not otherwise excluded, which would be primarily federal grants. So the revenues for 2019, that's your base year. Then the federal government assumes that because of an average that's out there, that there should have been a 4.1% increase in revenues for 2020. So it gets really messy from jurisdiction to jurisdiction because of how complex the revenue streams are. But the way it worked in Maplewood is that if the 2019 revenues are inflated by 4.1%, and then you compare that to the 2020 revenues, 2.6 million was the revenue loss. So it's called counterfactual revenue. So it's assumed revenue, it's theoretical revenue, it's not actual revenue. But they assume that we take our 2019 revenues, inflate them by 4.1%, and if you did not receive that much in 2020, it's a loss. And part of what came into play for Maplewood is we had significant, in 2019, we had some significant state funding for road projects that did not happen in 2020. That is just happenstance. It had nothing to do with COVID, but that's how the federal government works the formula, because they have to have something that works across. And there are winners and there are losers with this formula. I'd like to say that I think that we came out okay on this. We will be able to repeat this formula again next year, and I expect less of a revenue loss, but I do expect some. And the reason that it's important is because with this component of the grant, you can spend this money, as long as you spend it by the end of 2024, you can spend this money on any governmental purpose. So it doesn't have to be related to COVID. There's really no questions asked as long as it's a governmental purpose, and that's what we spend money on. You can't use it for debt service, and you can't use it for a rainy day fund, but you can spend it on any governmental purpose. So really looking forward to doing the calculation at the end of this year and seeing what we end up with. But so far, the 2.6 million, we've received 2.1 and a half. And so we have more loss than we have funds. That's okay because we can carry that forward into next year's allocation. So that's what we would like to do, is as much as possible. And the numbers will be whatever the numbers will be, but that gives you the most flexibility. There are obviously other components of the grant that we'll be accessing because we don't know what's going to happen next year with the revenue calculation. One thing that's in our favor is we had a 0% levy increase for 2021. So that, because property taxes are part of the revenue stream, that actually would work in our favor in this case. In 2020 as well, we did not have recreation revenues because of the, well, and that actually was directly related to COVID, but it was a loss in revenues that we were able to count. We also had a fairly significant loss in interest income because the rates were so significantly down. So that also played a big part into that 2.6 million. So moving on then, we have the ambulances and the cardiac equipment. sorry, as part of that revenue loss discussion. The ambulance fund had an actual loss, not a counterfactual loss, but an actual loss of over $600,000 because of runs being down, because of COVID. People weren't calling the ambulance. Because of COVID, they were afraid to ride the ambulance. So the runs are just about back up to normal now, just in case you were wondering about that. But so just to add to that story, we had built up the fund balance in the ambulance fund so that we anticipated paying cash for all of these ambulances in this next 5 years. When they lost $600,000 plus, $650 in revenues, then that's no longer going to be the case. So we would have to find another route, and that would likely be a taxable or a tax-exempt lease, which would be essentially debt at probably higher interest rates than we've seen in the past. But so that's why I think particularly the ambulances is something that should be considered very strongly with the ARPA funding, and also the ladder truck, just simply because it's such a huge, we'd probably be looking at a 15-year payment plan on that, and I think it would really be nice to, that would help the taxpayers out considerably, I think. So the third one is the social worker that would be embedded into the police department. You all know that we already have one that the county is paying. This one would be one that the city would pay for grant funding through 2024, and then the county would pick it up after that. So that there's a rough estimate there of $350,000, but I could be off. They're still working on putting together the numbers. And then the fourth one is the mall security cameras. Chief Nadeau worked on that before he left. He got them all to agree to pay $40,000, and then the city would pay $40,000, and that would increase the security at the mall, which would hopefully increase the business at the mall that's been suffering so badly due to COVID. We're still working through the logistics and the legal things associated with that. There's a lot of, some of these items do require some legal work, so our attorney is actually working on that one with Kennedy and Graven, but we will get you there. We'll get it one way or the other. We have a way. It's just which part of the grant we're going to use. The next one is the YMCA. They're asking for additional funding because they are concerned that some of these losses will carry over into 2022. They are asking for more than this, but this is the amount that the city manager and I talked about as a recommendation for assistance for the YMCA. As you recall, the $1 million that we provided in 2020 was meant to cover 2 years. So 2022 is what we're looking at now, and they are not confident about the traffic returning at the same levels it was pre-COVID at this point. The next line item is the premium pay for essential workers. That is a specific area of the grant, and that is going to be approximately $350,000, maybe a little more, maybe $400,000. That again is because essential workers had to work and didn't get a raise in pay. This was a one-time stipend that basically all employees receive because they're essential. The caveat on that is that we still have 4 out of our 7, is it, unions? We have 7 or 9. 4 that have not yet settled on that. So we're still not really sure where that one's going to end up. Yeah. And the next one, the COVID response, we continue to have some PPE expenses and some potential wages that we would be able to charge off. That's a number we can massage and tweak as well, depending on how much we want to charge for COVID response. The blight removal for affordable housing, again, that would be run through the EDA. And this also assumes that the county would be matching that. Again, any of these areas can be tweaked to increase the EDA or decrease some other area, increase some other area. These are kind of rough numbers right now. And the very last item is the MCC roof. And the reason that that's on there is it's likely not going to be something we can do with the grant because it'll most likely be done subsequent to 12/31/24. So it'll most likely be done in 2025. But I bring it up as it's something that we have to start planning for. It would be also part of the reason why we're looking at augmenting the building funds, and also part of the reason why we're keeping some of the reserves back, so that we can start building a plan for that. We'll start maybe increasing our levy in our building fund and maybe putting some of these reserves aside. So it probably is not going to be a part of the ARPA funding, but I put it in there for discussion. If you take that million out, it brings you down to 4.5 million, which is, pretty close to where our funding is going to be at. And we'll also have some interest revenue that we'll be able to utilize. So, and I know you guys want to talk about this, so we will get back to it. I'm just going to run very quickly through the rest of these slides. We did get some preliminary information from the county. I looked on their website from their assessor's abstract, which is done in approximately March, looking at approximately a 3.5% estimated market value increase, with the median value home to increase only 2.8% for 2022. We did get some information subsequent to that a couple of days ago, but it's still very preliminary because we don't have the fiscal disparities distribution. So we can't get down to the details like we normally do. We'll do that at the next session because we should have hopefully that information then. But it does look like the increase in estimated market value is going to be actually less than the 3.5. Not sure what that will do to the median home value. But some of you are probably wondering, homes are skyrocketing. How can this be? It's because of that lag in the assessment. So this was from, the assessment from a couple of years ago. So we're going to see, I think, in 2023, payable 2023 is when the property, homes are really going to, their values are really going to, I think you're going to see a shift to homes because the values are really going to increase. So it's good news and bad news. There's not a large increase in value, but unless that value is new construction, it doesn't really help the property owners that much anyway. So I don't think, just by looking at this initial information, it's really going to depend on the fiscal disparities, but I don't think the property owners are going to see a huge inflationary hit this year, which is nice. But I think they're really going to see it next year. So very quickly to go over some peer comparisons like we do every year. This I know is hard to see, so I'm just going to call out a couple of columns for you. You actually do have it also in your packet in a couple of places, but these are peers that are peers in by population only, so maybe roughly 10 to 15% above and below the population of Maplewood. The average is just about 40,000, so Maplewood's a little more than that, about 104,000, 104% of the average for population. As you can see in taxable tax capacity, Maplewood's about average for this group. Certified tax levy, that's one I want to point out. So this is 2019 information because it's the latest that the state auditor has compiled for all cities. So again, this is a couple of years old, so we already know that some of these things are changing, but especially when we start talking about debt. But the $22 million that the city levied in 2019 was just a little bit more than the average of the group, about 102, 103%. And then always, this is where it really shows up in these comparisons. Current expenditures is just another way of saying operating expenditures in governmental accounting ease. So 25 million roughly in 2019 for, and this is entity, or it's not actually entity-wide, but it's most of the funds. It's governmental funds. So 25 million. And that compares to 30 million of the average. And you can see some pretty big, St. Louis Park stands out as quite a bit higher, and Andover stands out as quite a bit lower because Andover does not have a police department, as most of you know. So that put Maplewood at about 83.5% of the average of expenditures for that group. So always much lower on the operating. That's a trend we've seen every year. The capital was lower. That can go up and down, but the capital was also considerably lower. Debt service being considerably higher. I think we did have some refunding activity that year, so that can be a little bit misconstruing. But I can tell you for a fact that we've already made considerable progress on this. Not only in the last few years since you've seen this, but in the years subsequent to 2019. So you can see that's where our levy is going in context of how the other jurisdictions are spending. The total expenditures were still about 94% of the average, so not bad there. Moving down to the very last column, outstanding bonded debt. We are no longer number one. In fact, I think we are now number 3. And that's in 2019. So down to $55 million at the end of 2019, and you all know it went down again. So, and this is the best number we've seen to date, 120% of the average of this group. So, moving in the right direction, and it moved further in 2020. That much I can tell you, even though I don't have the numbers for the other jurisdictions yet. So just very quickly to look at it on a chart. Look at the bottom, the gray and the yellow. It just kind of tells a little bit more of a story, and I really only put 5 or 6 years on here. Maplewood is the gray line. That's the levy for Maplewood. And then the yellow line is the average of our peers. You can see where there's a slight distinguishment where in 2014, Maplewood was maybe slightly higher, and you can see that gap closing for the levy, actually. Just very, very, very slightly. It's interesting to see that our peers, I think cities, for the most part, are trying to keep up with inflation and trying to keep up with what needs to be provided on an annual basis, and we all kind of look the same when it gets put on the chart. The tax capacity, Maplewood on the top there is the top numbers in the blue. You can see Maplewood was higher, and that's kind of leveled out, and you can see where everyone in the metro, or I can tell you that everyone in the metro, but this chart only includes those maybe 10 peers, kind of followed the same trajectory with the market values. And then this chart, don't pay attention to the top 2 lines because that, again, has some refunding bonding activity, but the bottom 2 lines, the blue is Maplewood operational spending, and then the orange is the peer average. So you can see they're following the kind of the same trajectory. We're just that same equidistance apart. So it'll be interesting to see how the levy chart changes once the debt gets down a little further. So without further ado, we'll just talk really quickly about the timeline. We've got another couple of workshops coming up. So rest assured that we will be back talking about all your concerns if we don't get to them tonight. And it'll be December 13th when all of this is adopted, including the financial policies. I won't go through this line by line, but there's a long process that we go through to get this far, and there's a long process to go from here. A number of different steps that we take, and lots of money, probably $80 million altogether, but we're only talking about 20 or 30 of it tonight, but 30 with the debt probably. Again, the fund structure, just so you understand that whole $80 million that I'm throwing around. We have governmental funds and we have enterprise funds. So primarily we're talking about the general fund, which is on the far left. And then we're also talking about the debt service funds, which is on the far right. And those are the things that for the most part, require a levy. There's a couple of small levies in the capital project funds, but for the most part, that's what we're talking about amongst all of the various different types of funds that the city has. With this, I can tell you that we will not have a lot of recommendations for policy changes. We tweak our debt management policy every year to keep bringing that number down, our benchmark down. Other than that, it would only be some minor housekeeping. How do we plan? We look at 10 years at a time. All of this gets run through the context of our 10-year plan so that we know what the decisions that we're making today, how that's going to affect, what additional operational expenses are we going to have related to the capital that we're purchasing in 2022, personnel costs, all of that gets fed into our 10-year plan. So that we can see that we're on a level debt service schedule, that we can see our property tax levies, even though they're projected, and our property tax rates and our property taxes, even though projected, are sustainable and affordable. So, I think right now we will take some questions from the council and, talk about the various different policy decisions that we outlined tonight. And anything else that you'd like to talk about in the next 15 minutes.
Thank you, Ms. Paulseth, for that overview of our first big budget discussion. One thing stuck in my mind, at one point you said that you were really excited to do the calculations. And I looked up here and I thought, it's good that you're doing what you're doing and that we are the policymakers, because I'm not sure that any one of us would really be thrilled to be doing the calculations that you are. So we are very grateful for that, but thank you. And thank you, Mr. Rube, because I know that you were a big part of this as well. Council, questions for Ms. Paulseth at this point? Councilmember Knudsen.
Yes. Excuse me. When I was looking at the attachment about what changed in the tax levy from last year, you've got some revenue reductions. Are there any, when you have revenue reductions or something like, there's generally an expense reduction that goes with it. How does that work out?
Okay. Councilmember Knudsen, that is a good question, and I know that's the way that it works in the private sector. And it also, to some degree, works that way here as well. So again, that's part of that discussion that we had about relocating the DMV employees that were assigned there for doing COVID, taking appointments, opening the door, letting people in. There are other places in the organization that have openings that we may be able to locate those employees. So that would probably be an equivalent
Sure.
of what you're asking.
Yeah, I mean, it's more of a general approach.
Yeah.
I don't targeting the DMV or anybody else. It's
Yeah.
just, and then when you go up and look at the 3% adjustments and so forth, is there any, and Mike can maybe help with this too, are there productivity indexes that you use? I'm thinking of, a lot of metrics are FTEs per adjusted something, or FTEs per population, or, things like that.
Yeah.
Are those productivity indexes used in our budgeting?
Councilmember Knudsen, we do have some of those that we do track. I think, and Mr. Sable maybe can add to this, but I think in the context of how our labor negotiations go.
Mr. Sable.
Thank you, Mayor, members of the council. Councilmember Knudsen, to answer your question, there is a small cohort of cities that we call ourselves sort of the benchmark cities, and we do make calculations about, at a rough outline, number of inspections per inspector, number of calls per police officer, number of responses for fire. It's not uniform across the enterprise, and it's not uniform across the cities, but there are a handful of us, and Maplewood is among the leaders, having that conversation about creating that benchmark threshold for what's a minimum standard of service. It's always a work in progress and something that we have fun with.
Thank you.
Councilmember Juniman.
Thank you, Mayor. On the ARPA funding page, you referred to two of them, the social worker and the blight removal, as the county playing a role at some point. What guarantee do we have that that's going to happen?
So, Councilmember Juniman and Council. We did meet with the county. They did, we did come to a verbal agreement on it. They were very excited about it. They feel that there's a real need in Maplewood for additional social work in the police department. So they did give us, there will be an agreement, I think, that will be working out, and I'm talking about the social worker here in specific, but so there will be a written agreement, and the agreement will be structured as such that if the county doesn't take it over, the city has the option of dropping the position if they want.
Was there any mention made when you were talking with them that other cities are trying to apply to them for the same thing? I mean, do they have any idea that this is coming?
So far, Maplewood's the only one that has the embedded social worker,
Right.
to my knowledge.
But there's two others that I know of that are working on it.
Okay.
And so
We were first in the door, Councilman.
I know that. And, nobody likes to hold their feet to the flame any closer than I do. Other people have to get in line. But I'm glad to hear that there's motion toward some kind of an agreement, but it just makes me a little nervous. And likewise, on the blight removal and affordable housing, you said there was a county match?
Yes, Mayor and Council. So I think you heard a little bit of that discussion when, I can't remember her name.
Oh,
but
Carrie was here?
Carrie from the county was here, and she
Okay,
talked a little bit about,
So that's the one where we're going to have a process for applying, but they don't have it yet, and then somebody's going to pick them, but we don't know who that is yet. Yes.
That's probably a good outline.
I just, that's why I'm asking, a county match. I like to know what it's based on,
yeah.
because there's a
Madam
difference
Mayor-
between a concrete foundation and a pebble foundation.
Yeah, I do understand. Perhaps Mr. Thompson would have some more insight in on that.
Mr. Thompson, can you shed some light on this?
Certainly, Mayor and Council. Yes, so yes, what Ms. Paulsess is referring to is utilizing the HRA levy dollars from the county. So we have learned since the council update that the funding from Ramsey County will be available starting in 2022, because although the levy doesn't come online until 2022 and funding in 2023, they're planning to kind of kickstart it with some of their ARPA dollars to start the programs in 2022. So we are in their ear every day that program is one of the higher priority programs that we want to be in line with to apply for the HRA levy dollars.
So, Mayor?
Councilmember Juniman.
So we can keep haranguing them for when there's going to be a process to apply for this, right?
Correct.
Thank you.
Councilmember Cave.
Most of them were answered. The question about, I had labor negotiations, and I know it's you, Mike, but do we have an idea when these negotiations are going to come to a conclusion?
Mr. Sable.
Mayor, council members, Councilmember Cave, we just finalized our mediation session with the Police Officers Union, and so we are just settling on an arbitration date. So our terms for arbitration have been set. It is wages and duration. We expect to have be in front of an arbitrator in early October, and we hope to have an answer before January of 2022. The other three units that are not finalized at this point, we are making an assumption that whatever the arbitrator rules in the first instance will apply to the remaining cases pending for arbitration. So we may have an answer on all four by January.
Okay.
So Mayor Abrams and
Just
Council.
1 second. Ms. Paulsett.
I just wanted to add to that he is talking about the 2021 contracts.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Paulseth. Well, one item for note of the City Council is we are going to propose a closed labor briefing to talk about not only 2021 negotiations, but also strategy and development of the 2022 conversation. Because once these have been settled, we'll be back at the table with all 7 units for 2022.
Yeah.
Because it's so much fun.
Thank you.
Councilmember Cave, any other questions?
Nope.
Okay, Councilmember Villavicencio.
Thank you. My question would be around the YMCA COVID relief. Can you tell me a little bit of information more about you know, what that money would go to for the YMCA.
Certainly, Mayor Abrams and Councilmember Villavicencio. Basically, it would go towards operating. They are anticipating a revenue shortfall. And we're still in conversations about what the cuts are going to be with, you know, if you're considering a revenue, as Councilmember Knudsen brought up, what are your expenditure cuts going to be to close the loop? But at this point, they feel that the membership isn't going to get back to pre-COVID levels in 2022, and they need to have a plan for that, to keep the doors open, basically.
Councilmember Villavicencio, any other questions?
Yeah, I just remembered I had just another clarifying question really quick about the social worker funds. Also, so just to clarify, so right now it's a 3-year program, right, with the county, and then this would be proposed for how long after that? Do they say?
Okay, Mayor and Council, that's a good question. So this is actually a program that we could begin anytime whenever the council is ready, because we do have money. This and the mall security cameras we're ready to move forward on, and the premium pay as well. But the city, how it works is the city would fund it for this first 3 years, 2022 through 2024. They had given us verbal, not a promise, but kind of just a verbal agreement that they would continue to keep that social worker on and pay for those wages subsequent to 2024. Obviously, that could change. But the city would not have to pay for it unless they wanted to after that. I hope that answered your question. Okay.
Maybe a point of clarification. Are we talking about, we currently have one social worker
Correct.
embedded?
This would be the second
This is a
one.
second social worker, just so everyone is clear on that. It is a second social worker. I guess I knew that. I thought, okay, it's a second social worker that we're looking at, and the reason being the kind of success and the caseload that that Amy, the current social worker, has taken on. We have seen such success that we really see that this is a program that we want to grow, and that's why that's included in here. It is a second social worker.
And if I could add to that, the county was quite excited about it.
Pardon me?
The county was quite excited about it because they know that the need is there. And if the city was willing to pay for three plus years, they were very excited about that.
I think the thing about it is that it is a way to provide services and not be siloed. I think that was always maybe one of the issues with providing health and human services in the county, is that it was very siloed. I think from my experience with the county that has gotten better. COVID has been a great learning curve in that regard, just in terms of providing services. And so having two social workers related to the county here makes an awful lot of sense in terms of efficient delivery of service. So, thank you. Councilmember Villavicencio, are you done?
Yes.
Okay, Councilmember Knudsen.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, or it's a question, I guess. I'm fully supportive of this social worker plan. It kind of goes back to when I was on the EMS commission, when we looked at all the calls we get that we can't transport. And immediately you look at it as a loss, and the staff and everybody started to figure out, well, these people need some help. They might not need transport, but they need some help. So, what I'm getting at is I'm wondering if, what kind of analytics can we look at for this? What other byproducts, what other help in the community? What about healthcare costs? All the kind of things that just, that start to broil or boil when you don't do these kinds of interventions.